In the mathematics of empires, there exists a formula that the Arithmetic Collective believed to be absolute. It states that victory belongs to the power with superior numbers, superior technology, and superior strategic position. For 11,000 years, this formula had never failed. Wars were won before they began, calculated in the cold precision of fleet tonnages and weapons yields and the industrial capacity of star systems.
The collective had refined this science to such perfection that they could predict the outcome of any conflict within a margin of error so small it approached certainty. They called it the certainty doctrine, and it had made them masters of 17,000 worlds.
I was Vethkan Sorrel, second arithmancer of the Strategic Calculation Division, and I had spent 347 years perfecting the models that predicted galactic warfare. I had calculated the fall of the Marenth hegemony 7 decades before their last fleet surrendered. I had foreseen the collapse of the Trilateral Compact when their demographics shifted toward unsustainable military recruitment.
I had modeled the rise and fall of civilizations as one might model the orbits of planets, with the same mathematical inevitability, the same cold precision. I believed in numbers. I believed in the certainty doctrine. I believed that the universe was a vast equation, and that those who understood it could never be surprised. I was wrong. The error was not mine alone. Every arithmancer in the collective, every strategic calculator and probability assessor had made the same mistake. We had counted humanity's ships. We had measured their industrial capacity. We had cataloged their weapons systems and assessed their tactical doctrines and projected their maximum possible mobilization capacity. The numbers were unimpressive. 237 military vessels of various classes, 14 colony worlds with limited industrial infrastructure, a home planet that had nearly destroyed itself with primitive nuclear weapons barely 4 centuries before achieving faster-than-light travel. Their expansion rate was pedestrian, their technology derivative, their strategic position precarious.
By every metric we measured, humanity was irrelevant. A minor species in a minor sector, destined to either be absorbed by a greater power or collapse under the weight of their own violent tendencies. We assigned them a threat assessment rating of 0.003, below the threshold for active monitoring, barely above the level of pre-spaceflight civilizations.
We counted their ships. We measured their strength. We missed the only one that mattered. The devouring began in the outer spiral, in sectors so remote that the collective had never bothered to claim them. At first, the reports were dismissed as sensor malfunctions or the exaggerated claims of frontier observers. Entire star systems going dark, civilizations vanishing without distress calls, the fabric of space itself seeming to shudder and tear in patterns that made no mathematical sense. Then the darkness came closer. The Scythe were the first major power to fall. They had controlled 800 worlds, commanded fleets that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possessed weapons that could shatter moons and reshape planetary orbits. By the certainty doctrine, they should have been able to hold any enemy at bay for centuries. They lasted 17 days. I was in the grand calculation chamber when the final Scythe transmission reached us. The holographic display showed their home world, a world I had visited once, a world of crystalline spires and floating cities and beauty that had taken them 40,000 years to create, being consumed by something that defied categorization. Not destroyed, consumed. The cities did not burn or shatter, they simply ceased to be,
swallowed by a darkness that seemed to exist between dimensions. The screaming lasted for 3 hours before the transmission ended. In the silence that followed, the first arithmancer turned to us, her face gray with a fear that our equations had no variables to express.
"Recalculate everything," she said. "Find me a model that explains this. Find me a formula for victory." We tried. For 6 months we tried. We gathered every scrap of data we could find about the devouring. We analyzed the patterns of its advance, the nature of its weapons, if weapons they could be called, the behavior of the entities that seemed to exist within the consuming darkness. We built models and ran simulations and pushed our computational capacity to its absolute limits. Nothing worked. The devouring did not follow rules. It did not obey the mathematics of warfare. It simply came, and everything it touched was erased from existence. The Morinth fell next, then the Keth Dominion, then the Outer Confederacy. One by one, the powers of the galaxy were extinguished like stars going dark. Their billions of years of accumulated history and culture and knowledge simply gone. Not defeated, not conquered, unmade. By the time the devouring reached the borders of collective space, we had lost contact with over 200,000 worlds. The refugee fleets that poured into our territory brought stories that our arithmancers could not process, tales of darkness that thought, of emptiness that hungered, of something so alien that even looking upon it too long caused minds to fracture and memories to unravel. The collective's response was calculated, precise, and utterly inadequate. We deployed our fleets in the formations that had won us 11,000 years of dominance. We unleashed weapons that could crack planets and extinguish suns. We threw everything we had at the advancing darkness, and it made no difference at all. Our ships vanished into the consuming void. Our weapons were absorbed without effect. Our carefully calculated defensive positions were overrun as if they did not exist. In 8 months, we lost 9,000 worlds. I watched the fall of Veth Prime, my birth world, from the bridge of a fleeing refugee transport. I watched the darkness swallow the grand calculation chamber where I had spent 2 centuries of my life, watched it consume the libraries that held 11 millennia of mathematical knowledge, watched it unmake everything I had ever known or loved or believed in. My daughter was on Veth Prime. Her name was Selin. She was 112 years old, still young by our standards, still full of the certainty that numbers could explain everything, that mathematics was the language of the universe, that nothing could surprise a mind trained to calculate all possibilities. Her last transmission was a single equation. I still don't know what it meant. Perhaps she was trying to model the devouring even as it took her. Perhaps it was a final message encoded in the only language she truly knew. Perhaps it was nothing at all, just the random firing of a brilliant mind being erased from existence. I have stared at that equation for months now. I have never been able to solve it. The survivors of the collective scattered like seeds in a stellar wind. Some fled toward the galactic core, hoping that distance might buy time. Others sought refuge in the territories of species that had not yet fallen, trading knowledge and resources for sanctuary. A few, the desperate, the hopeless, the ones who had nothing left to lose, turned toward the one sector of space where the devouring had not yet reached. Human space. I was among them, though I could not have said why. Perhaps it was simply that human territory was in the opposite direction from the advancing darkness. Perhaps it was the faint, irrational hope that any sanctuary was better than none. Or perhaps it was something else, a nagging curiosity about this species that our calculations had so thoroughly dismissed.
The human border station was nothing like what I expected. The collective built our installations to reflect our greatness, vast, elegant structures of crystalline mathematics, every angle and curve expressing the precision of our civilization. Human Station Outer Reach 7 was utilitarian, a functional collection of metal and composite materials designed for purpose rather than beauty.
It should have been depressing. Instead, I found it strangely appropriate. Beauty had not saved the collective. Perhaps function would serve better.
The human officer who processed my refugee application was a woman named Lieutenant Commander Yuki Tanaka. She was small by human standards, with dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. Her uniform was clean but worn, her manner professional but not cold. "Second Arithmancer Vethken Sorrel," she read from her datapad, pronouncing my name with careful precision. "Strategic Calculation Division, Arithmancy Collective. Currently listed as extinct."
Collapsed, I corrected, though the distinction seemed meaningless. Some of us survived.
I'm sorry for your losses. The words were simple, direct, without the elaborate formal expressions that most advanced species used for such occasions. I found their simplicity almost painful in its honesty.
"You are aware of what is coming," I said. It was not a question. The devouring was not a secret, not anymore. Every surviving species in the galaxy knew of the darkness that was consuming everything in its path. "We're aware." "And you are accepting refugees nonetheless, even knowing that our presence may draw the devouring's attention to your territory?" Lieutenant Commander Tanaka looked up from her datapad, and I saw something in her eyes that I had not expected. Not fear, not bravado, something quieter, more settled. "Arithmancer Sorrel, we've done the calculations ourselves. The devouring is coming regardless of whether we accept refugees. It's consumed over 200,000 worlds. It's not going to stop because we closed our borders." "Then why accept us? Why take on additional burdens when your resources are limited and your own survival is not assured?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because it's the right thing to do, and because we remember what it was like to have nowhere to go." I did not understand her meaning at the time. I filed it away as another data point, another piece of the puzzle that was humanity. A puzzle I was only beginning to realize I had never seriously attempted to solve. The settlement assigned to collective refugees was on a world called New Ganymede, a moon orbiting a gas giant in a system that had been colonized barely 2 centuries before. It was not beautiful. It was not elegant. It was cold, harsh, functional, a place where survival required constant effort and resources were never quite abundant enough. The humans who lived there did not seem to notice the harshness. They went about their work with a quiet efficiency that I found unsettling, neither complaining about their circumstances nor boasting about their resilience. They simply did what needed to be done and then moved on to the next task. I spent the first weeks in a state of numb exhaustion, unable to process everything I had lost. The other collective survivors were much the same, arithmancers and calculators and engineers who had spent their entire lives believing in the certainty of their models, now adrift in a universe that had proven every certainty false. It was during the 3rd week that I had my first real conversation with a human. His name was Marcus Chen, a middle-aged man who worked as a logistics coordinator for the settlement.
He found me sitting alone in an observation dome, staring out at the stars with the blank gaze of someone who no longer knows how to calculate anything.
"Mind if I join you?" he asked. I gestured to an empty seat. He sat, holding a cup of some hot beverage that I would later learn was coffee.
For a long time, neither of us spoke. The stars wheeled past the dome, ancient light from ancient fires, indifferent to the darkness that was consuming the galaxy.
"You were a strategist," Marcus said eventually, "back in the Collective."
I was an arithmancer. I calculated probabilities, predicted outcomes, modeled the mathematics of warfare. The words tasted like ashes in my mouth. I was very good at it.
"I've read about your certainty doctrine. Impressive system. Worked for a long time."
Until it didn't. I felt the familiar bitterness rising in my throat. The devouring cannot be calculated. It does not follow rules. It simply consumes.
Marcus nodded slowly. "What about us?"
What about you? Did you calculate humanity before all this happened?
I hesitated. The honest answer was embarrassing, but I no longer had the energy for diplomatic evasion. "Yes, your threat assessment rating was 0.003. You were considered irrelevant." He laughed, a strange, warm sound that seemed entirely inappropriate given the circumstances. 0.003? That's almost an insult.
It was an accurate assessment, based on the data available.
Fleet size, industrial capacity, technological level, strategic position, rate of expansion, all the variables that determine a species' military potential.
Marcus took a sip of his coffee. That's a lot of variables.
The certainty doctrine accounts for over 40,000 factors in its comprehensive assessment model. "And yet you missed the devouring."
The words hit me like a physical blow. He was right. For all our 40,000 factors, for all our centuries of refinement, we had completely failed to predict or prepare for the threat that had destroyed us.
"Yes," I admitted, "we missed it."
Do you know why? Because it does not follow the rules of conventional warfare. Because it exists partially outside our dimension. Because...
"No," Marcus shook his head. "You missed it because your model only accounts for what can be measured. Ships and factories and weapons. Quantifiable things. But the most important variables in any conflict aren't quantifiable." I stared at him, uncertain how to respond. "What variables do you mean?"
Will, determination, the willingness to keep fighting after every calculation says you should surrender. The ability to adapt when all your plans fail. The refusal to die, even when dying is the logical outcome.
Those are not variables. Those are abstractions. They cannot be modeled.
No, Marcus agreed. They can't be modeled. That's exactly the point.
I thought about his words for a long time after that conversation. I thought about them as I watched the human settlement function with its quiet, efficient purpose. I thought about them as I observed the way humans responded to crisis, not with the calculated precision of the collective, but with something messier, more adaptive, more resilient. I thought about them as the reports came in from the front lines, as system after system fell dark, as the devouring crept ever closer to human space. And I thought about them on the day that everything changed. It was 7 months after my arrival on New Ganymede. The devouring had reached the human border territories, consuming 3 colony worlds in the space of a week. The refugee populations had swelled to the point where resources were stretched thin. Every calculation I ran, old habits die hard, suggested that humanity would fall within the next 30 to 60 days.
I was in the settlement's communication center when the transmission came through. A young human technician, she couldn't have been more than 25, pulled up the display with hands that did not tremble, and I saw something that made no mathematical sense. The human fleet was mobilizing, not retreating, not evacuating, mobilizing. And the numbers were wrong. That can't be right, I said, leaning closer to the display. Your fleet registry shows 237 vessels. This display shows...
That's impossible. Your industrial capacity cannot support...
Arithmancer Sorrel, a voice behind me. I turned to find Lieutenant Commander Tanaka standing in the doorway, her face calm, her eyes holding that same settled something I had seen at our first meeting. "Would you come with me, please?"
I followed her through corridors that suddenly seemed different than they had before, less functional, more purposeful. We emerged onto a command deck that I had not known existed, filled with displays and personnel and a quiet intensity that made my scales prickle with unease. "What is this?" I asked. "This is what we didn't show you, what we don't show anyone. Until we have to." She led me to a central display, and I saw the full scope of humanity's mobilization for the first time. 14,000 ships was just the beginning. Across human space, industrial facilities that had appeared to be civilian infrastructure were revealing their true nature. Factories that had been producing consumer goods were disgorging weapons platforms and combat drones. Shipyards that had seemed capable of building only a few vessels per year were launching dozens, hundreds, their true capacity hidden behind layers of deliberate inefficiency. "You hid this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You deliberately concealed your military capacity." "We've been hiding it for 300 years. But why? The Collective's assessment, the threat assessment rating, if we had known."
"If you had known, you would have seen us as a threat. You would have calculated that it was more efficient to eliminate us before we could grow stronger. Your certainty doctrine would have demanded it."
I opened my mouth to deny it, but I couldn't. She was right. If our models had shown humanity's true potential, the Collective would have acted to neutralize that potential. It was what the mathematics demanded. "We learned early that the galaxy doesn't reward honesty," Lieutenant Commander Tanaka continued. "It rewards either overwhelming strength or apparent weakness. We weren't strong enough to project overwhelming strength, not yet, so we chose apparent weakness instead." "You deceived everyone, every species that assessed you, every power that calculated your potential."
Yes, for 3 centuries.
"We're patient." I stared at the display, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with everything I thought I knew about this species. The numbers were staggering. Not just the ships, though those were impressive enough, but the coordination, the planning, the sheer scale of the deception required to hide this level of military capacity for 300 years. "Your certainty doctrine counted our ships," Lieutenant Commander Tanaka said. "It measured our factories and cataloged our weapons. It calculated our military potential down to the decimal point. But it missed something." "What?" She smiled, a small, fierce expression that contained no humor. "It missed the ship that wasn't in any registry. The ship that doesn't officially exist. The ship that we've been building in secret for 273 years. She touched a control and the display changed. I saw it, and I forgot how to breathe. It was not a ship in any conventional sense. It was a world, a moon, hollowed out and converted, its entire mass transformed into something that my mind refused to categorize.
weapons systems that dwarfed anything the Collective had ever built, power generation that exceeded the output of entire star systems, engines that bent space-time in ways that violated every law of physics I had ever learned.
"We call it the last light," Lieutenant Commander Tanaka said. "It was designed for one purpose, to ensure that if everything else failed, if every other option was exhausted, humanity would have one final response, one ship that could stand against anything the universe could throw at us."
I struggled for words. This is not possible. The resources required, the technology. No species could build this.
No species that valued efficiency. No species that calculated the optimal use of resources. No species that built what made sense. She turned to face me fully. "We didn't build what made sense, Arithmancer Sorrel. We built what we needed."
Needed for what?
For survival. We've been running from extinction since before we left our birth world. Ice ages, asteroid impacts, plagues, wars, environmental collapse. We've nearly destroyed ourselves a dozen times over. Every generation inherits a world that the previous generation almost ended. We learned a long time ago that making sense isn't the same as surviving.
I looked at the last light on the display, at its impossible dimensions and its obscene power, and I understood something that the certainty doctrine had never been able to model. Humanity had not built this ship because it was logical. They had not built it because the calculations supported it. They had built it because somewhere deep in their species' soul, in the accumulated trauma of 1 billion years of near extinction, they had known that someday something would come that required an answer beyond all reason. They had built it because they refused to die.
"The devouring," I said. "Can the last light fight it?"
"We don't know. No one knows. The devouring is unlike anything anyone has faced before." Lieutenant Commander Tanaka's expression was calm, but I saw the weight behind her eyes, the weight of a species that had been preparing for this moment for centuries without knowing exactly what it was preparing for.
"Then why deploy it now? Why reveal your greatest secret?"
"Because there's nothing left to hide from. The devouring doesn't care about politics or strategy or the balance of power. It just consumes. And if we don't stop it here, there won't be anyone left to keep secrets from."
Over the following days, I watched humanity's true face reveal itself. The quiet, functional species that had seemed so unimpressive was gone. In its place was something older, something harder, something that had been waiting behind the mask for 300 years. The 14,000 ships of the initial mobilization grew to 30,000, then 50,000. Vessels emerged from hidden construction yards in asteroid belts and gas giant moons and the empty spaces between stars. Weapons platforms that had been disguised as mining stations powered up for the first time. Defense grids that had been dormant for decades came online in cascading sequences. And at the center of it all, the last light emerged from its hiding place in the deep void, a moon-sized testament to human defiance that warped the light of nearby stars with its passage. The collective survivors watched in stunned silence. Everything we had believed about humanity, everything our calculations had told us, was being rewritten in real time. This was not a minor species. This was not an irrelevant power. This was something that had been hiding in plain sight, growing in the shadows, preparing for a moment that it had somehow known was coming. "How?" asked Varys, one of the senior arithmancers who had survived the fall of the Collective. "How could they have hidden this from us? Our sensors, our intelligence networks, our calculations. We should have detected some trace of this." "We didn't look," I said. "We saw what we expected to see, a young species with limited resources and violent tendencies.
We calculated their potential based on what they showed us, and we never considered that they might be showing us exactly what they wanted us to see.
But the resources, the time, the coordination required. They're patient. They planned for centuries. They built in secret while we dismissed them as irrelevant. I felt the bitter irony of it like a blade in my chest. The certainty doctrine was certain about everything except the possibility that someone might be deliberately feeding us false data.
The human fleet moved to intercept the devouring at the edge of their territory. I watched the tactical feeds from the command center on New Ganymede, surrounded by collective survivors and human personnel who worked their stations with that unsettling calm that I was beginning to understand was not indifference, but preparation. The first engagement was unlike anything I had ever seen. The devouring came as it always came, a wave of consuming darkness that existed partially outside normal space, that absorbed energy and matter and consciousness with equal indifference. Human ships that entered its influence simply vanished, erased from existence, just as collective ships had been. But the humans did not break.
They adapted. They pulled back, analyzed the nature of the enemy's attack, and adjusted their tactics in real time. Ships that had been operating in standard formations suddenly dispersed into patterns that made no mathematical sense, chaotic, unpredictable, impossible to model. The devouring, which had always advanced with mechanical inevitability, faltered for the first time.
"They're confusing it," Varys said, watching the display with wide eyes. "The devouring operates on pattern recognition. It consumes predictable structures. The humans are deliberately making themselves unpredictable."
That shouldn't be possible. Chaos cannot be sustained in military operations. The coordination required.
They're not coordinating. They're improvising. Each ship, each captain making independent decisions within a shared framework. Varys shook his head in disbelief. It's madness. It violates every principle of strategic doctrine. "It's working." And it was. The human fleet was taking losses, heavy losses, but it was slowing the devouring's advance. For the first time since the darkness had emerged from the outer spiral, something was resisting it. Something was pushing back. Then the last light entered the engagement zone. I have witnessed the death of stars. I have seen planets shattered, and fleets annihilated, and civilizations erased from existence. But I have never seen anything like what happened when the last light spoke. The weapons it deployed did not target the devouring in any conventional sense. They reached into the spaces between dimensions, into the same realm where the devouring existed. They struck at the thing's essence, at whatever passed for its consciousness, at the fundamental nature of its being. The devouring screamed. I did not know it could scream. No one had known. The entity that had consumed 200,000 worlds, that had erased civilizations without apparent effort or emotion, that had seemed as inevitable and implacable as entropy itself, it screamed, and the scream resonated across frequencies that should not have existed. And then it retreated. Not just paused, not just faltered. It retreated, pulling back from human space, withdrawing from territory it had already begun to consume. The darkness receded like a tide, leaving behind empty space and the shattered remnants of what it had taken. In the command center, there was absolute silence. Human and collective alike stared at the displays, unable to process what they were seeing. For 18 months, the devouring had advanced without pause, without setback, without anything approaching defeat. Now it was running. From one ship, Lieutenant Commander Tanaka was the first to speak. "All units, advance. Press the attack. Don't let them regroup. The human fleet surged forward, 50,000 ships moving in concert with the last light, pursuing the retreating darkness. The engagement that had begun as a desperate defense became something else, something that the Collective's mathematics had no formula for.
A hunt. The war that followed lasted 18 months. I watched most of it from New Ganymede as humanity pushed the devouring back across the sectors it had consumed. World after world was reclaimed, not restored, for what had been consumed could not be brought back, but freed from the darkness that had claimed it.
The last light led every major engagement, its impossible weapons tearing holes in the devouring's dimensional presence. Human ships filled the gaps, coordinating with that same strange blend of order and chaos that had confounded the enemy in the first battle. Losses mounted. Humanity paid a terrible price for every light year they reclaimed, but they never wavered. I asked Marcus Chen about it once, during the long months of the campaign. How did they keep fighting? How did they sustain such losses without breaking?
"We've been losing people since the beginning," he said. "Since before we were human, really. Every generation buries the previous one. Every generation inherits a world scarred by the mistakes of its ancestors. We don't fight because we expect to win without cost. We fight because the alternative is giving up. And we've never learned how to do that."
The Collective would have calculated the acceptable loss threshold. We would have determined the point at which continued resistance became irrational. And then what? And then we would have surrendered, negotiated, found a compromise that minimized further losses.
Marcus smiled, though there was no joy in it. You can't negotiate with the devouring. You can't compromise with extinction. So what's the rational response when the only options are fight or die?
I had no answer. "We fight," he said. "We've always fought. We always will. Not because we're brave or noble or special, but because we're too stubborn to know when to quit."
The devouring's final stand came in the outer spiral, in the same empty sectors where it had first appeared. The human fleet, now swollen to over 100,000 vessels, bolstered by ships from the dozen species that had survived the initial onslaught, surrounded the darkness's last stronghold.
I was there, aboard a collective observation vessel that had somehow survived our civilization's fall. I watched the last light position itself at the center of the fleet, its moon-sized bulk dwarfing even the largest human dreadnoughts. The final battle lasted 3 days. The devouring threw everything it had at the human fleet, waves of consuming darkness that erased ships by the thousands, dimensional storms that tore holes in reality itself, psychic attacks that shattered minds and turned crews against each other. The losses were catastrophic. I watched vessels vanish one after another, their crews simply gone. And still, the humans did not break. On the 3rd day, the last light fired its primary weapon for the final time. The beam that emerged was not light in any conventional sense. It was something else, something that existed outside the normal spectrum, something that reached into the dimension where the devouring truly lived. The scream that followed was worse than the first one. It was the death cry of something that had never experienced mortality, the final shriek of an entity that had consumed civilizations without ever imagining that it could be consumed in turn. The darkness collapsed, not retreated, collapsed. The consuming void folded in on itself, shrinking and shrinking until there was nothing left but empty space and stars and silence.
In the aftermath, I stood on the observation deck and stared at the place where the devouring had been. Around me, humans were cheering, embracing, weeping with exhaustion and relief. They had lost over 30,000 ships, over 18 million lives. They had paid a price that the certainty doctrine would have calculated as unacceptable.
They had won. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka found me there hours later. She looked older than she had when I first met her, not physically, but in some deeper way. The calm certainty in her eyes had been replaced by something more complex, more worn, more human. "Your calculations," she said, "do they explain this?" I shook my head. "No, nothing explains this. You should not have been able to win. The numbers, the probabilities, every model I can construct says that humanity should have been consumed along with everyone else."
But we weren't.
"No, you weren't." She stood beside me, looking out at the stars. "Do you know why we built the last light, Arithmancer Sorrel? Why we spent nearly 3 centuries and more resources than any rational analysis could justify on a single ship?"
Because you anticipated a threat like the Devouring?
No. We had no idea the Devouring existed. We built it because we knew that someday something would come. Something we couldn't predict, couldn't calculate, couldn't prepare for in any conventional way. We built it because the universe has been trying to kill us for as long as we've existed, and we knew it wasn't going to stop.
That's not rational. You cannot prepare for every possible threat.
You're right. We can't. But we can prepare to refuse, to fight, to keep going no matter what comes. She turned to face me. Your certainty doctrine counted our ships. It measured our industrial capacity and our weapons systems and our strategic position. It calculated exactly how powerful we were, and it got the number exactly right.
Because power isn't the same as strength. Your doctrine measured what we had. It didn't measure what we were willing to do with it. It didn't measure how far we would go, how much we would sacrifice, how absolutely we would refuse to accept extinction.
She gestured at the empty space where the Devouring had been. The Devouring consumed civilizations that were more powerful than us. It broke species that had existed for millions of years, but it couldn't break us, not because we were stronger, but because we were more stubborn, because we would rather die fighting than live surrendering.
And the last light?
The last light was just a tool, a very big, very expensive tool. But tools don't win wars. Will wins wars. Determination wins wars. The refusal to stop, no matter what, wins wars. I thought about Celine, about the equation she had transmitted in her final moments. I had never been able to solve it, never been able to understand what she had been trying to tell me. But standing there, looking out at the stars that humanity had saved, I began to wonder if perhaps the equation had never been meant to be solved. Perhaps it had been her way of saying that some things transcended mathematics, that the universe contained variables that could not be quantified.
"We counted your ships," I said. "We counted every ship in your fleet."
I know. We missed the only one that mattered. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka smiled, a tired, genuine expression that held no triumph, only the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who had carried an impossible weight for far too long. "Everyone does," she said. "They count the ships they can see. They measure the weapons they can detect. They calculate the power they can quantify. And they miss the thing that actually matters, the will to use all of it, no matter the cost." I am Vethkan Sorel, second Arithmancer of a civilization that no longer exists. For 347 years, I believed that mathematics could explain the universe.
I believed that with enough data and enough calculation, any outcome could be predicted, any threat could be quantified, any future could be known.
I was wrong. The certainty doctrine was not false. It was incomplete. It could measure power and resources and strategic position. It could count ships and catalog weapons and calculate industrial capacity. But it could not measure the thing that actually mattered, the will to survive.
Humanity understood this. They had always understood it, in ways that older and more powerful species had forgotten. They had learned it in the ice ages that nearly froze them into extinction, in the plagues that nearly wiped them from existence, in the wars that nearly ended their civilization before it reached the stars. They had learned that survival was not a calculation, but a choice made over and over again in the face of every obstacle the universe could throw at them.
The galaxy counted humanity's ships. Every civilization that bothered to assess them ran the numbers and found them wanting. 237 military vessels, 14 colony worlds, a threat assessment rating of 0.003. They missed the only ship that mattered.
Not because it was hidden, though it was, not because it was powerful, though it was that too, but because no calculation could account for what it represented, the absolute, unwavering, inexhaustible human refusal to accept extinction. The last light was just a ship, but it was built by a species that had been saying no to the universe since before they climbed down from the trees, a species that had stared into the void 1,000 times and 1,000 times had answered with defiance, a species that did not know how to quit, did not know how to surrender, did not know how to accept that anything was truly impossible.
I live among them now. The remnants of the collective have scattered across human space, rebuilding what we can, learning what we must. We will never again believe that our calculations are complete. We will never again assume that we understand the universe well enough to predict its threats. But we have learned something more valuable than any equation. We have learned that survival is not a matter of mathematics, but of will. That the universe will always throw new horrors at the living, new extinctions, new challenges that no model can anticipate, and that the only defense against that endless darkness is the simple, stubborn refusal to go quietly into it. Humanity taught us that, not with lectures or explanations, but with example, with the last light and the 50,000 ships that followed it, with the 18 million lives lost in the final campaign, with the 300-year deception that hid their true nature from a galaxy that would have destroyed them for it. They counted humanity's ships. They measured and cataloged and calculated and assessed. They determined with mathematical certainty that this species was irrelevant. They missed the only one that mattered. And now the devouring is gone. The darkness that consumed 200,000 worlds has been pushed back into whatever dimension it came from. The galaxy has been saved by a species that the galaxy dismissed, by a ship that should not have existed, by a will that could not be quantified. I think about Selin sometimes. I think about her equation, still unsolved, still mysterious, and I wonder if perhaps she understood, in those final moments, what I have taken so long to learn, that some things cannot be calculated because they are not numbers at all. They are choices. They are acts of will. They are the simple, defiant decision to keep existing in a universe that wants you dead. The stars are still burning. After everything, After the devouring and the war and the losses that can never be recovered, the stars are still burning. And somewhere out there, the last light drifts in the void, waiting, watching, ready.
Because the universe will try again. It always does. New threats will emerge. New extinctions will threaten. New darkness will rise from the spaces between stars. That is the nature of existence, an endless struggle between being and unbeing, between life and the void. But now there is something in the galaxy that the void has never faced before, something that cannot be calculated or predicted or prepared for, something that will meet every new darkness with the same answer it has always given.
Not today. Not ever.
The galaxy counted humanity's ships.
They missed the only one that mattered.
And the universe will never make that mistake again.